The first thing I noticed was the car. Rachel always parked in the driveway with the front wheels turned slightly left. A habit from her first car, something about the handbrake on a hill, even when there was no hill. 21 years of marriage, and I had never once seen her park any other way. The car in my driveway had its wheels pointed straight ahead. I told myself it meant nothing. I had been awake for 19 consecutive hours. I had spent the previous day dragging a neighbor's pickup truck across the mouth of the cul-de-sac to discourage foot traffic. And the day before that, boarding up the Hendersons' ground floor windows after they stopped answering the glass. The city was 3 miles away. The smoke from it had been visible for a week. First black, then gray, then the particular color of things that have been burning too long to have a color anymore. So when I saw my family's car in the driveway at 4:47 in the morning, my first response was not joy. It was arithmetic. They had left 16 days ago. Rachel's parents lived 62 miles north, well outside the initial contamination zone. I hadn't reached anyone by phone in 11 days. I had no way of knowing what the roads looked like now, or what had happened to the towns between here and there. And now, they were back, and the car was parked wrong. I stood at the upstairs window for a full minute before I went down. Rachel was standing at the front door. Not knocking, just standing, both hands at her sides. That was also wrong. Rachel knocked before using her key for anything, even her own front door, even after 21 years of living here, because she said it was polite, and politeness was a discipline, not a convenience. She had her key. She was not using it. She was simply standing in the dark in front of a locked door. I unlocked it from inside. She stepped in and said that they'd been driving a long time and everyone was tired. Her voice had a particular flatness to it, the kind that settled into her when she was sick and pushing through it, when she had decided not to acknowledge the struggle because acknowledging it would make it real. I filed it under exhaustion, under stress, under 62 miles of whatever those roads had become. She smelled faintly of pine. And something else, something I couldn't identify in the moment, flat and medicinal beneath the clean outdoor smell, like a hospital corridor with the windows open. I told myself it was hand sanitizer. I told myself it was the smell of having been somewhere unfamiliar for too long. Lily came in behind her, 16 years old, and in the previous year she had developed the particular economy of teenagers who communicate primarily through strategic absence. Not sullenness, just a practiced self-containment, a way of being in a room that didn't demand anything from it. She moved through the door without speaking and went directly to the stairs. And I let her go because that was Lily. And Lily was allowed to be Lily. Noah was last. My son was 9 years old and had never once walked through a front door without some form of announcement. He had a specific routine. Drop the backpack inside the threshold, spread his arms wide, and narrate his own arrival in third person as though he were a sportscaster calling a game-winning play. It was loud and unself-conscious, and I had never once asked him to stop, because some things you recognize as things you will need to remember later, and you leave them alone. He came in without his backpack. His arms stayed at his sides. He looked at me from the doorway, and I cannot accurately describe what I saw in his expression, despite the number of times I've tried since. It wasn't blank. It wasn't frightened. It was something that lived just behind his eyes, slightly recessed from the surface, as if something were observing through him rather than with him. I said, "Hey, bud." He said, "Hi, Dad." The words were correct. The spacing between them wasn't. I locked the front door. I told myself they were exhausted. I told myself 62 miles of what the world had become would change the way anyone moved, spoke, looked at something familiar. I put the kettle on. I did not sleep. I made tea that nobody drank. Rachel sat at the kitchen table with both hands flat on the surface, palms down, and watched me move around the space with a steady, continuous attention that I recognized but couldn't place. The overhead light was too bright. I had replaced the bulb 2 weeks ago with something more industrial when I converted the kitchen into secondary storage. And the white light flattened everything, made the walls look institutional. Rachel didn't squint. Normal eyes squint under that kind of light. Hers adjusted with the quality of a camera correcting for exposure rather than a person flinching from glare. I sat across from her and asked about her parents. She said they were fine. I asked what happened. Why they came back early. Why now, after 11 days of silence? She said it seemed like the right time. I said, Rachel, I haven't been able to reach anyone in 11 days, and I need to know what's happening out there. She said there were a lot of people on the roads, and the phones weren't working right, and her parents were fine, and they thought it made more sense to come home. It was a complete and grammatically sensible answer. It had no texture. Rachel's baseline was detail. She thought in specifics. She described a drive the way a documentarian would, noting the name of every rest stop, the particular quality of the light, whether the coffee tasted burned or just stale. She once gave me a 10-minute account of a routine trip to the grocery store that included a secondary plot involving a woman in the parking lot and a cart with a broken wheel. And I had sat there and listened, and the whole thing was genuinely interesting. That was how Rachel talked. She built small worlds out of the material of ordinary experience. She gave me 4 sentences about a 16-day absence and offered nothing else. I watched her hands on the table. The knuckles were slightly pale, the way they got in winter when circulation slowed. But it was late spring and the night outside was mild. I reached across and put my hand over hers without making a decision about it. Just did it the way you do something you've done 1,000 times, without ceremony. Her skin was cold. Not the ambient cool of someone who'd come in from an easy night. Cold in the way of something that had stopped generating its own warmth and was borrowing temperature from the surrounding air. I held her hand and smiled, and said I was glad they were back. And inside my chest, something tightened into a specific shape that I recognized from the night 6 years ago when a doctor used a particular tone of voice during a routine appointment. And I spent the next 3 hours waiting to hear what he meant by it. That feeling, that exact shape. I let go of her hand. I said she should get some rest, and I would check the perimeter and come back in. She stood smoothly and moved toward the hallway, and I watched her go, and her gait was correct. Her weight shifted naturally. Her stride matched what I knew. But there was something in the quality of her movement that reminded me of very precise footage of a person walking, rather than the person themselves. The proportions were right. The intention behind the proportions was harder to locate. I went to the garage. I sat on the floor between my workbench and the recycling bins and looked at nothing for a long time. They were home. My wife and my children were in the house. They were tired, and the roads had been difficult, and communication had been impossible, and they were home. I was catastrophizing. I was primed by 3 weeks of sustained threat response to read disaster into everything, including the parking angle of a car and the temperature of my wife's hands. I made myself list 5 things that were normal. Rachel's hair, Lily's silent entrance, Noah's shoes, his blue canvas sneakers, the ones he wore until the soles separated because he refused to believe shoes could wear out. The shoes, that was something. The shoes were his. I held on to that. I went back inside. Lily was in the bathroom for a long time. I stood in the hallway outside it for 11 minutes. I checked my watch, because that is the kind of thing you do when the alternative is thinking too clearly about why you're standing in a hallway watching a door. The water ran continuously. Not the sound of showering, no curtain pull, no shift of spray against tile. Just water running over something motionless, or someone standing beneath it without adjusting their weight. I knocked. She said she was fine. I said I just wanted to check. She said fine again, in exactly the same tone, and I waited until the water stopped and the door opened. She came out in a towel and looked at me with her mother's eyes, the same dark brown, the same slight upward tilt at the outer corners. And I searched her face for my daughter the way you search a familiar neighborhood after a long absence, looking for what changed. She looked right. She looked correct. She looked like Lily the way a very precise drawing looks like its subject. All the measurements accurate, the proportions sound, the likeness undeniable. Something in the space between the measurements was different. I couldn't find the word for what was absent. I still can't. She said, "Good night, Dad," and went to her room and closed the door. I went to check on Noah. He was in his bed, which was the right place for him to be at 5:30 in the morning. The lamp on his bedside table was still on. Noah slept with it on when he was anxious, had since he was 4 years old, and we discovered that darkness was something he needed to earn his way back to gradually. And he was lying on his back with his eyes open, not staring at the ceiling the way an anxious child stares at the ceiling, waiting for sleep. Just open, passive and open, the way a room is open when no one is in it. I sat on the edge of his bed. I asked if he was okay. He said yes. I asked how Grandma and Grandpa were. He said they were okay. I asked what the drive was like. He said long. Noah was the child who would describe a trip to the gas station as a narrative adventure involving at minimum 3 supporting characters and a central conflict. He was the child who last Thanksgiving had delivered a 7-minute unprompted monologue about the aerodynamic properties of dinner rolls. Long was not a word in his functional vocabulary for describing lived experience. Long was a placeholder. Long was what you said when you were not interested in language. I reached over and touched his forehead. The warmth was wrong. Not cold like Rachel's hands. Different. A warmth that was faintly off in temperature, slightly above the ambient air, but without the particular human heat that comes from within. The heat that belongs to someone. Like a surface that had absorbed warmth rather than generated it. I smoothed his hair back. I said, "Sleep tight." He said, "Night, Dad." I turned off his lamp. I stood in the dark hallway between his room and Lily's, and then between Lily's and mine and Rachel's. And I listened to the house breathe around me. Houses breathe. This is something I know from 22 years in this particular structure. The tick of the baseboard heat and the specific way this hallway handles air on still nights. The sound of Rachel turning in our bed 3 rooms away. I stood in the hallway, and the house was not breathing the way I knew it. The sound of the 3 of them was subtly wrong. 3 people breathing in 3 rooms, and the quality of it, the rhythm, the duration of the pauses, was off by a measurement I couldn't quantify. Like 3 clocks set to the same time, but running on different mechanisms. I went downstairs. I sat at the kitchen table where Rachel had sat. The tea was cold. The cups were untouched. All 3 cups, including Rachel's. I had watched her hold it. Daylight made it easier to pretend. There is something about sunlight that the human brain trusts unconditionally. Some deep, ancient assurance that the things you can see clearly cannot also be the things you should fear. I have thought about this since, about the specific cruelty of what I was experiencing being most insidious in the warmth and clarity of a spring morning, with birds working through whatever abbreviated songs they still managed in the absence of normal human noise, and the light coming through the kitchen windows at the angle it always came at that hour. Rachel made breakfast. That was the phrase I clung to through the whole of that first morning. Rachel made breakfast. She stood at the stove and went through the motions with full competence. The pan heated to the right temperature, the eggs cracked on the bowl's rim in the way she preferred, rather than against the flat of the counter. The toast timed correctly against the eggs. She did not speak while she cooked. Rachel usually talked while cooking, a continuous low-level narration of the process that was more ambient sound than communication. A habit I had absorbed so completely that its absence now produced a silence that felt shaped and deliberate. But she made breakfast. Lily came down at 9. She sat at the table and ate without looking at her phone. Lily had not looked at her phone once since she walked through the door at 4:47 that morning. Her phone had been in her jacket pocket. I had seen the rectangular outline of it when she came in, and she had not checked it. Not once. Lily was 16 years old, and her phone was an extension of her neurology. She checked it in the way other people blinked. The fact of it sitting untouched in her pocket for 4+ hours was something I could not explain in a way that made sense, and so I didn't try. Noah ate half of what was on his plate and left the rest precisely arranged, untouched, the way you arrange food on a plate if you want it to look eaten without having eaten it. He was careful about it, almost methodical. I watched him do it from the corner of my eye and said nothing. After breakfast, I told them I needed to do a perimeter walk. Check the boards on the east-facing windows, assess the blocked end of the cul-de-sac. Normal maintenance tasks that required me to be outside for 40 minutes. I said it casually and watched each of their faces as I said it. Rachel looked at the table. Lily looked at me steadily, without the particular shade of teenage discomfort that normally accompanied any suggestion that a parent might be absent for a period of time. Lily's normal response to being left in the house was relief, not hostility, just the baseline independence of a teenager who preferred her own company. She looked at me the way an adult would, the way someone who was waiting would. Noah said, "Okay, just okay." I went outside and stood in the morning and breathed through my nose and tried to think clearly. I knew the shape of what I had been observing. I had spent 16 days boarding up windows and watching the neighborhood, understanding, slowly, with all the deliberate resistance of a person who does not want to understand something, what the infection did to people. I had seen the Hendersons' upstairs window moving on the 5th night, a silhouette that used to be Carl Henderson pacing with a rhythm I'd come to recognize from the early broadcasts. I knew the behavioral profile. I had absorbed it without consciously cataloging it. The way you take in information you need to survive, even when your mind is busy arguing with itself about whether the information is real. What I was seeing in my house was different from what I had seen in Carl Henderson's window. What I was seeing was earlier, slower, a different gradient. And I did not know if that meant they were not what I feared, or if it meant they simply were not yet what they would become. I stood outside and looked at my house and understood that the distinction, "not yet," was the most dangerous phrase in the English language. I found a reason to be busy all day. This is what I'm ashamed of when I look back on those hours. Not the fear, not even the paralysis, but the industry of my avoidance. The focused, almost creative effort I put into generating tasks that kept me in motion without requiring me to sit down and look directly at what was in front of me. I resecured the garage door brackets. I inventoried the food storage cabinet I had already inventoried twice. I spent 45 minutes checking the oil and coolant levels on a car I hadn't driven in 2 weeks and had no plans to drive. Rachel moved through the house quietly. She did laundry, methodically, without urgency, transferring loads between washer and dryer with the efficiency of someone completing a program rather than someone who chose to do laundry on a particular morning because it needed doing. When I came in from the garage, she was folding in the kitchen, and she looked up and smiled. The smile was right. That is what I keep returning to. The details that were right. The smile reached her eyes. The creases at the corners appeared correctly. The timing was natural. If you had photographed that smile, you could not have identified what I was seeing in it from across the kitchen, because what I was seeing was not in the photograph. It was in the milliseconds of the smile's assembly. A fraction of a second too deliberate, a fraction of a second too aware of itself. The smile of someone who has learned what a smile is supposed to accomplish, rather than the smile of someone who simply smiled. I smiled back and asked if she needed help. She said no. In the afternoon, I sat in the living room with Noah and suggested a board game. This had been our routine. Sunday afternoons, bad weather, rainy weekends. And Noah had worked through most of the games in the hall closet with me over the past 3 years, winning more than he lost because he thought 3 moves ahead and then acted like he hadn't. He set up Clue with the familiar practice speed he'd always had, placing the weapons and the cards without fumbling. We played for 30 minutes. He won. Of course he won. But he made his winning deduction 14 moves before he should have had enough information to make it. I had watched him accumulate the evidence, the cards shown, the suggestions made, and the conclusion he reached was 2 or 3 logical steps ahead of what the information on the table supported. He had made a correct deductive leap from insufficient data. And when I looked at him across the game board, he was watching me with that expression that sat too far behind his eyes. The expression I still couldn't name. I said, "How did you know?" He looked at the board. He said he just figured it out. I said, "But how?" He looked at me. He said, "I don't know, Dad. I just knew." Kids said things like that. Yeah, 9-year-olds made intuitive leaps all the time. They thought in patterns their conscious minds couldn't articulate. I held that firmly. That night after dinner, which Rachel cooked again, different meal, same silence, same precision. I heard the 3 of them in the hallway talking in low voices. I stood very still in the bedroom doorway and listened. The voices were too quiet to resolve into words. What I could identify was the cadence. Question, answer, pause, question. A cadence I associated with planning, with coordination. I went to bed. I lay on my back and felt the mattress beside me, where Rachel slept without moving, without the minor unconscious shifts of a person genuinely at rest. She was still, completely, continuously still. I counted my own breathing. I counted it for a long time. In the morning, I stopped pretending I didn't know. I found the food, not the absence of it. I had already noted that, the plates arranged to look eaten, the cups of tea untouched. I found the food itself. Under Noah's bed, in the gap between the box spring and the baseboard, pushed flat against the wall in a way that required deliberate placement. A cracker wrapped in a paper towel. 4 grapes, individually separated, as if they had been carried there one at a time. The detritus of meals concealed rather than consumed. I stayed crouched beside his bed for a long time after I found it. They weren't eating. Or they were eating something other than what I was preparing. Or their dietary requirements had changed in ways I didn't have the knowledge to understand yet. What I knew was that my family was not eating what I put in front of them, and they were performing the act of eating with enough precision that I had not noticed for a full day. They were managing me. That was the thought I could not unthink once it arrived. They were managing my perception of them. Whether that was deliberate, whether it arose from something retained in their cognition, some instinct toward preservation of the existing dynamic, or whether it was reflexive, behavioral, something the infection choreographed without their input, I couldn't determine. But the architecture of the performance was specific and consistent. They had assessed what I expected, and they were providing it. Someone home meant someone who needed feeding, so there was the appearance of eating. Someone returning from a long journey meant someone tired, so there was the appearance of sleep. Someone you loved meant someone who smiled, so there was the smile. I went through the house after they came downstairs. Under Lily's bed I found nothing, but her phone was on her desk, screen dark, and when I pressed the button, the battery was dead. Not the red indicator of recent depletion, but the black of something long discharged. Lily had not used her phone in days, not since before they drove home. The phone in her pocket last night had been a prop. In the bedroom, on Rachel's side, I found the indentation in the pillow from a head that had rested on it, but the sheets beneath were cold and undisturbed, the way sheets look when a weight has been placed on them without warmth and movement. She had put her head on the pillow. She had not slept in the bed. I sat on my side of the mattress and looked at the room I had shared with Rachel for 17 years. The photographs on the dresser, the reading lamp she'd had since her apartment in her 20s, the shade slightly yellowed, the stack of library books on her side, unreturnable now, their due dates long past and entirely irrelevant. I looked at all of it. I heard her downstairs. I heard the deliberate domesticity of her moving in the kitchen, filling the kettle, setting it on the burner, the sounds of a person making tea for a husband who was upstairs, which was the sound of a marriage, which was the sound of everything I had organized my life around, and it was coming from someone who was not quite my wife, in a house that was not quite my home anymore. And I had to decide whether the difference between the almost and the actual was something I could continue to live inside. I went downstairs. She handed me a cup, still hot, made the way I liked it. I drank it. I didn't say anything. Neither did she. We stood in the kitchen and performed a marriage for 8 minutes, and then I said I was going to work in the garage, and she said okay, and I went. I want to be precise about what happened with Lily. It was the afternoon of the second day, and I was coming through the upstairs hallway with a box of supplies I'd brought in from the garage. Batteries, a hand crank radio, a basic medical kit, and her bedroom door was open by about 6 inches, which was more open than she'd had it since they came home. And I glanced in the way you glance through any partially open door in your own house without making a decision about it. She was standing at the window. That was ordinary. What was not ordinary was the angle of her gaze, which was not the downward angle of someone watching the street or the yard. It was level, aimed at the middle distance, the horizon-seeking angle of someone scanning a large area. The way a person stands at a window when they are not looking at something particular, but maintaining awareness of a broad zone. She hadn't heard me, or she had heard me and was not responding. I stepped back out of the sight line of the gap and stood in the hallway with the box and tried to steady my breathing. In 3 weeks of Outbreak response, I had developed the ability to slow my pulse through deliberate breath pattern, slow it enough to think rather than react. I use that now. I went through what I had. Cold hands, no eating, flat affect, deadened social presentation that preserved the architecture of the relationship while evacuating its interior. Phone as prop. Noah's strange deductive clarity, that watching thing behind his eyes. Rachel's smile assembled a fraction too deliberately. The food under the bed, the undisturbed sheets. And now, Lily at the window in a surveillance posture I associated with the infected I had watched move through the neighborhood in the early days. The way they oriented outward toward large spaces with a kind of patient, distributed attention. I put the box down and knocked on her door 3 times. Clearly. She turned. She looked at me. She said, "What's up?" Her voice was wrong in a new way. Not the flat middle register I had identified the first night, but something slightly more altered, slightly more distant. Like a radio station you've been receiving on a weak signal that has drifted another millimeter away from the frequency. I said I wanted to talk. I went in and sat on her desk chair. And she sat on the bed, and we faced each other. And I told myself to look at her, not to search for evidence, not to triage, but to be her father in a room with her, and see what was true. She was in there. Something of her was still present. I want to be clear about that. Because it matters, and because I have not given myself enough credit in my own accounting of those days for having actually looked. Whatever was wrong, whatever had happened in the 62 miles between here and her grandparents' house, had not completed itself in Lily the way I had seen it complete in others. She was part way. She was between. That was not comfort. That was a different kind of horror. She looked at me with that expression that was almost right, and she said, "Dad, I'm really tired." I said, "I know." I said, "Are you okay?" She looked at the window, the same level gaze, then back at me. She said, "I don't know." And in those 2 words, there was something I recognized. Some texture, some resistance, the sound of a person who still had enough left to know that they didn't have an answer. I heard my daughter in those 2 words. Whatever the thing behind her eyes was, in that moment, Lily was still somewhere in the room with me. I reached over and put my hand on her shoulder, and she let me. Her skin was cool through her shirt. I said, "I love you." She said, "I know, Dad." I left the room and went down the hallway and stood at the top of the stairs with my hand on the banister and did not move for a long time. Noah bit me on the morning of the 3rd day. I want to describe it accurately because accuracy is the only dignity left in this accounting. And because the word bit implies something I need to contextualize. He did not lunge. He did not display the full kinetic violence of late-stage infected. The lockjaw, the blind forward momentum. He reached for my hand where it was resting on the kitchen table, the way he used to reach for it when he was small and wanted to be held. And he took it in both of his. And then he put his mouth on my wrist, and I felt the pressure of his teeth. I said his name. He stopped. He pulled back. He looked at his hands, at my wrist, with an expression I can only describe as recognition. Not the recognition of having done something wrong, the recognition of something observed, as if a part of him had watched what another part of him had done and found it interesting. I did not pull my hand away quickly. I pulled it away the way you create distance, from something startled in the wild, slowly, without threat signaling, without alarm. I stood up from the table. I said I was going to the garage. My voice was level. I have no idea how that was possible. He watched me go. In the garage, I pulled up my sleeve and looked at my wrist. The skin had not broken. His teeth had found the surface layer and pressed and stopped. Whether that was residual restraint from the person he was, or something else entirely, I couldn't determine. But the skin was unbroken. I stood there for a long time with my sleeve pushed back, looking at my unbroken wrist. I had run out of the ability to negotiate with what I knew. Every argument I had been conducting with myself for 2.5 days collapsed simultaneously. All the alternative explanations, the exhaustion theories, the stress response frameworks, the careful constructions of ordinary cause and effect that I had been erecting and maintaining with the focused labor of a person who needs to not know a thing, they all came down at once. And what was left was simply what was in front of me. My wife and my children had come home. They were not right. They were trying, in whatever way they were still capable of trying, to be what they had been. Something in them retained the script, the relationship architecture, the behavioral signatures, the knowledge of what I expected and what would maintain the equilibrium of the household. They were performing a family, and they were becoming something else. Or had already become it, and were somewhere along the deterioration curve, moving toward the condition I had watched take Carl Henderson's silhouette and reduce it to a pacing shadow in an upstairs window. I put my back against the cold metal of the garage door and slid down to the floor. My son had put his mouth on my wrist. My unbroken wrist. I sat on the garage floor and let myself feel what was true for exactly 1 minute. I counted. 1 minute of allowing all of it to land. The full weight, the full grief, the specific unbearable particularity of these 3 people, and what it meant that something had happened to them. And then I stood up. Because there was no one to give me more than a minute. Because the minute was all I had to spend. I had to decide what to do. I went back inside because leaving was not an option I had yet arrived at. I know how that sounds. I know what it must read like from outside the experience. That I should have left the moment Noah reached for my wrist, that staying was irrational, that the calculus was straightforward. The calculus is never straightforward when the numbers are people you built your life from. I understand this has no strategic value. I'm not defending it as a decision. I am describing what it was. I went back inside and I began to pay attention in a different way. Not the attention of someone accumulating evidence. The attention of someone trying to understand what was still present. I needed to know, with whatever precision was available to me, the extent of what remained in each of them. What was still Lily? What was still Rachel? What was still Noah? Because if there was something still functioning on the side of who they were, I needed to know what I was dealing with before I determined what I had to do. I watched them through the afternoon of the 3rd day. Lily had moments. I identified 2 clearly within a 3-hour window, moments where her expression shifted from the ambient flatness into something more particulate, more specific, more hers. Once when she passed the bookshelf in the living room, and her hand moved toward a particular spine. A battered paperback she had been reading before they left, carried around the house for 2 weeks, with a bookmark halfway through, and then stopped. The hand moved and then didn't, and the expression that crossed her face in the space of that arrested motion was legible. Loss. The recognition of something wanted and unreachable. She was in there, diminished and receding, but present. Noah was different. Noah's intervals were shorter, and the thing that came through in them was harder to read. In the late afternoon, he climbed into the armchair in the living room. His chair, the one that had been his since he was small enough to disappear into it. And he pulled his knees up and sat the way he'd always sat. And for about 4 minutes, he was 9 years old in his armchair in his living room. I watched him from the hallway, and I felt something I refused to identify, because there is no word for it that does not diminish it. Then he looked at the window, and whatever had opened in him closed again. Rachel was the most difficult to read, not because she was furthest along, though I suspected perhaps she was, but because 21 years of intimacy meant I had the most to compare against. Every deviation landed with a precision it didn't land with the children. Every wrong cadence, every under-inflected word, every smile at 8 degrees less warmth than I knew. I caught all of it, and it accumulated differently than it accumulated with Lily or Noah. It accumulated in the part of me that was constructed specifically from the experience of loving her. That night, I couldn't sleep. And she was beside me, also not sleeping. And I lay in the dark and thought about all of it. About what was still there, about what was still in transit, about the timeline, not whether, but when. And I thought, she knows me. Whatever she had become or was becoming had access to everything she had been, which meant it had access to everything she knew about me, including how long I could hold on before I acted, including what I would and wouldn't be able to do. And I thought, if she knows me, she knows what I'm waiting for. I lay very still in the dark. From beside me, very quietly, Rachel said, "Owen." She said my name and then didn't say anything else for a long time. I stayed still. I didn't turn my head. I didn't signal that I was awake, though she knew I was awake. She had always been able to tell, had some internal barometer calibrated specifically to my wakefulness. Something built from years of shared sleep and early mornings and the specific intimacy of breathing beside someone in the dark. She said, "I know you know." I turned my head. I looked at her in the dark. I could see the outline of her profile, the shape of her nose, the line of her jaw, the profile of my wife. She said it in her voice, her actual voice. Not the flat register of the past 2.5 days, but the voice I knew. The slightly lower timbre it got late at night, the voice she used when she was being precise about something that mattered. I heard it, and something in my chest lurched upward like a caught breath. She said, "I've been trying to stay as long as I can." I said, "Rachel." She said, "Don't." I understood what she meant. She meant, don't do the thing I was going to do, which was say something that required her to be more present than she was capable of being. Something that put a demand on whatever she was holding together with whatever she still had. She was asking me not to spend it. She said, "The kids." I said, "I know." She said, "Lily is still. She's still mostly there. Noah is. It's faster with him. I don't know why. It's faster." I said, "Rachel." She said, "You need to stop calling my name like I'm about to disappear, Owen. I need you to listen." I said, "I'm listening." She said, "I can't tell you what to do. I'm not asking you to. But I need you to know that I'm not. That this is me right now saying this to you. Whatever happens, this is me." I said, "I know." She said, "Do you?" I said, "Yes." We lay there in the dark without speaking, and I could feel her beside me. Feel the wrongness of her warmth, and also feel her, Rachel, the specific person, the gravity field of her. The way 21 years of loving someone becomes a physical dimension of any space they occupy. She said, "The three of us came back because the idea of the house, of you, was still the thing we moved toward. I don't know if that means anything about what we are now. But it's why we came back." I said, "I know." She said, "You need to be careful about what's coming. I don't always. I'm not always in charge of." She stopped. She said, "I tried to keep Noah from doing that to you this morning." She knew. She had been aware and unable to stop it, and she was telling me she had tried. I lay in the dark and absorbed that. The image of Rachel, wherever she was inside all of this. Reaching for the capacity to intervene between her son and her husband and not being able to reach far enough. She said, "Owen, you need to do what you need to do. I want you to know I understand that. Whatever it takes for you to be safe. With all of us, with any of us. I understand." I said, "Don't ask me to do that." She said, "I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm telling you that if you do, I understand." A long silence. I said, "Are you still you right now?" She was quiet. Then she said, "Mostly. For a little while longer, probably." I reached over in the dark. I took her hand. Cold. The cold I now knew. I held it anyway. She let me. In the morning, she was the flat register again, and could not meet my eyes. The next 48 hours, I will describe the way a person describes the parts they cannot bear to expand, with compression, with the mercy of brevity, because there is no version of rendering it fully that serves any purpose. Lily was first. It was not violent in the way that word gets used. It was not what I had seen on the streets in the early weeks. What happened was that I came into the living room on the morning of the 4th day and she was standing at the window again. The level surveillance gaze, the broad outward scan. And she turned when she heard me enter and looked at me with no Lily in her expression. None. The intervals had closed. I had been holding myself in readiness for this, the way you hold a load that has grown progressively heavier, bracing for the moment it exceeds what your body can carry. I had been building toward the particular act of will required to be present in this moment without fracturing. I said, "Lily." She looked at me. I said her name again. I waited 10 seconds that were the longest 10 seconds I have experienced. Nothing came back. I said, "I love you." In case any part of you is still hearing this, I love you. She moved toward me. I am not going to write in detail about what followed. What I will say is that she was not harmed, and she could not harm me. And the room we were in had a door I was able to close and secure from the outside. And after I had done that, I stood in the hallway with both hands pressed flat against the door. I breathed through it. Noah was the same day, a different hour. The intervals that had still been flickering in him were gone by the time I went to check. And I did not try to call him back because I had learned, standing in that hallway outside Lily's door, that the calling back, the naming, the last attempt at contact, that was for me, not for them. And I did not have the right to spend what remained of my composure on myself. I secured him safely. Rachel was the 4th day, late afternoon. I spent 20 minutes sitting outside the closed bedroom door on the floor of the hallway. I had the conversation I needed to have with the Rachel from 2 nights ago. The real one. The one who had told me she understood. The one who had taken my hand in the dark and let me hold it. I said everything I wanted to say, and I said it plainly and without performance, because there was no one to perform for, and that made it easier to say the true things. I said them. I went in. She was at the window. She had been at the window for most of the morning, and I had known it, and I had let the last hours of the 4th day happen without rushing them. She didn't turn. I said, "Rachel." She turned. For one moment, one fraction of a second. Her eyes found me. I saw her. I know what I saw, and I'm not going to argue with anyone who doubts it, because that moment belongs to me and cannot be contested. And then the moment passed. I did what I had told myself I would do. What Rachel had told me, she understood I would need to do. What love? The actual working mechanism of love, stripped of sentiment, reduced to its operational core. Required. I am not going to describe it. I sat in the kitchen for a long time. There's no version of this where the kitchen was not involved. It is the room I keep returning to, the room where the tea sat untouched, and the eggs were cracked correctly, and Rachel folded laundry with her eyes slightly too empty. The kitchen is the room where a household performs itself most completely, which made it the room where the difference between performing and being was most legible. And it is the room where I sat after. I didn't cry. I want to be accurate about that, because I think it matters as a data point about what this kind of thing does to a person's interior. I did not cry. I sat at the kitchen table where Rachel had placed her cold hands on the surface, and I sat there without crying, which I believe had less to do with reserve or strength than with the fact that what I was experiencing was too large and too specific to convert into the general currency of grief. It had not yet become abstract enough to feel. It was still entirely concrete. The cups were on the counter, all 3 of them, the ones I had washed and set to dry after the first untouched cups of tea, the new ones from the following morning, clean and stacked by someone performing order. I looked at them for a long time. I thought about the moment before they came home, the 4:46 moment, when the car was in the driveway and I was at the upstairs window doing arithmetic. I thought about how much I had wanted to simply go down the stairs and open the door and have it be uncomplicated. how much that want had cost me in the days that followed. Whether the cost was inevitable, whether any amount of earlier clarity would have changed what the days looked like, or whether the progression was going to be identical regardless. And the only variable was how much of my own resources I spent on negotiating with the facts. I stayed in the kitchen until dark. Then I made a decision about what I was going to do next. And the decision was not dramatic and not heroic, and not any of the things that decisions of consequence are supposed to be in the narrative of survival. I decided to get up. I decided to be methodical. I decided to do the things that needed doing in the next 6 hours, with the specificity and care the situation required. Because Rachel had told me to be safe, and that was the last directive I had from her, and I was going to honor it with every piece of competence I had left. I started with the house. I moved through it room by room, the same rooms I had moved through for 4 days, reading the signs of what was wrong, now moving through them for a different purpose. I was efficient. I was not cold. Efficiency is not coldness, and I refused the equation, but I was functional, and function was what the moment required. By the time I had done what needed doing in the house, it was past midnight. I went to the garage. I filled a pack with water, food, a medical kit. I took the hand crank radio. I took a photograph from the hallway, a particular one, from 2 summers ago. The 4 of us at a state park. Noah mid-leap off a dock and everyone in the frame laughing at him. I folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of my jacket. I stood in the garage in the dark. I did not go back through the house. I had already said what I needed to say. The leaving was just logistics after that. I opened the garage door, and I went out into the night. The neighborhood was quiet in the way it had become quiet. Not the quiet of absence, but the quiet of altered occupation, of things moving slowly through the dark that were not what they once had been. I knew the rhythms of it by then. 3 weeks of watching had calibrated my sense of its patterns. And I moved through the cul-de-sac and past the blocked end and onto the main road with the particular economy of someone who had learned to exist in the space between attention and invisibility. I had no destination. That is not entirely true. I had the general understanding that a fixed position was no longer viable, which meant movement was necessary, which meant I needed to move in a direction. I knew the geography of the area well enough to have a prioritized list of potential refuges, and I was going to work through them methodically, starting with the nearest and expanding outward, which was as much of a plan as the situation could support. What I didn't have was a reason. I want to be precise about this because I think it matters, and because I have not been honest about it in the accounting I have given myself. I had function. I had methodology. I had the operational will to continue moving, because stopping was not an option available to me, not because I was strong, but because stopping required a decision in favor of stopping. And I hadn't made that decision. The absence of the decision to stop is not the same as the will to continue. I want to own that distinction. I walked for 3 hours. The roads held the particular desolation of late Outbreak, not the chaos of the early days, with vehicles abandoned mid-maneuver and doors hanging open on lit houses, but the settled desolation of a thing that has sorted itself, that has reached its new equilibrium. The world looked like something photographed in the after rather than during. The after is in some ways harder than the during. I found a pharmacy with a back room that had been secured recently. The lock on the interior door was new, and whoever installed it had done so with competence, and then apparently left or been unable to return. Because when I worked the door open, the room was stocked but unoccupied. Water, protein bars, a sleeping bag still in its packaging, a camping lantern with fresh batteries. I closed and resecured the door. I sat on the sleeping bag still in its packaging because I didn't have the agency to take it out. I turned the lantern on low and sat in the small circle of its warmth. I took the photograph out of my jacket. I looked at it for a long time. The four of us at the state park. Noah mid-leap, everyone laughing. The particular body language of a family that has its own internal language, that has had it long enough to not notice they have one. A photograph of a unit that functioned. I put it back. I lay down on the packaged sleeping bag. I did not sleep for a long time. When I did sleep, it was without dreaming, which was the only mercy available, and I will not complain about the form mercy takes when it arrives. In the morning, I woke at first light and was moving within 6 minutes, because that was what was required, and because Rachel had asked me to be safe. And that was the shape my days were going to take now. 10 days after I left the house, I found other people. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because the discovery of other survivors carries in the narrative of survival a weight of relief and renewed hope that I was not in a position to feel in the way the story form implies. I did not feel relief. I felt recognition, a flat, accurate acknowledgement that here were other people also continuing, for the same inconclusive reasons I was continuing, and that there was probably more utility in combining the continuation than in conducting it separately. His name was Gil, 47 years old, a high school history teacher from the district 2 towns over, who had been living in the back of a hardware store with a woman named Priya, a nurse, and a teenage boy named Marcus, whose parents had not made it past the first week. 3 people, stocked for several weeks more, moving toward the same general network of potential destinations I had been working from. I told them about my family on the second night. I said it directly, the way you say irreducible things when you are past the capacity for circumspection. My family came back from 62 miles away. Something had happened to them. They were infected in some way I still don't fully understand. The deterioration was slower than what I'd seen in others, and there were intervals where they were still present. And then there weren't. I had done what was necessary. I was still here. Gil listened without interrupting. Priya asked one question, which was whether I had been bitten. I said no and showed her my wrist. She looked at it with a clinical attention and nodded, and that was the end of the medical question. Marcus didn't say anything. He was 17 and had lost both parents in the first week, and I understood that my account had landed somewhere in him that would take time to settle. I did not push for a response. That night, I sat outside the hardware store on an overturned milk crate and looked at the sky, which was clear for the first time in days. The stars were the same as they had always been, which was not comfort exactly, but was something. A continuity that operated outside the scale of any of this, indifferent and ancient and ongoing. I thought about Rachel's voice in the dark. I think about it most nights. I'm not trying to reconstruct it into something useful. I'm not holding on to it in a way that prevents me from doing the next thing. I'm just telling you that it lives in me. The sound of her actual voice in the dark of our bedroom saying, "I know you know," saying, "I've been trying to stay as long as I can," saying, "You need to do what you need to do." That voice, that specific register, her. I carry it the way you carry something that has no weight, except when you forget about it. And then, when you remember, all the weight arrives at once. I carry it, and I keep moving, and I don't know what is ahead. There is nothing neat at the end of this. There is no resolution that discharges the weight of what happened in that house. There is only the ongoing fact of continuation and the question of what to do with it. How to be inside it, how to be useful inside it, how to be worthy of the voice in the dark that said be safe. I think about Noah's arms, the way they used to spread when he walked in the door. I think about Lily's hand stopping halfway to a spine on a bookshelf. I think about Rachel's hand in mine, in the dark. Cold, held anyway. I'm trying. That is what I have. I'm trying. I keep the photograph in the inside pocket of my jacket, against my chest. Not as ritual, not as punishment. I keep it because the four of us were in that frame together, and because the frame was real. The specific, undiluted reality of a summer afternoon. Noah's knees bent mid-leap, the water catching light below him. Rachel's hand raised to shield her eyes and tilted toward laughter. That was true. That happened. No version of what came after can unhappen that afternoon. This is what I have learned about grief in the absence of any structure for processing it. You do not work through it in sequence. You carry it in the pocket near your heart and you move. And some mornings it is a stone, and some mornings it is something almost like warmth. And you cannot predict which, and you do not get to choose. Rachel told me she understood. She told me while she still could tell me anything. I am building my life around that sentence, not around what came after it. Just that. She understood. In the dark, in her voice, she understood. I will hold it for as long as I have. Let me know how you liked the story in the comments. And if you want to hear new stories, please subscribe. Thank you.